I think all of us have had a dream at some point in our lives. Maybe you still have one. Maybe you had one when you were a kid. You wanted to become a footballer, open a restaurant, make music, start a business, or become a game developer, travel the world, or just build a life that looked completely different from the one you were living. For a while, you genuinely believed it was going to happen. You could picture it. You could see yourself doing it. You could almost feel what your life was going to be like once you finally got there. And then, somewhere along the way, something changed. You got older, you started losing hope, the dream just felt out of reach. People started telling you to be more realistic. Maybe you failed at something. Maybe you tried and it didn't work. Maybe you never even got the chance to try like most people. And eventually, almost without noticing it, you started telling yourself, that's probably not going to happen. Not because you stopped wanting it, you just stopped believing it was possible. And I think that's how most dreams actually die. They just slowly become something you used to want. And that's a strange thing about growing up. You just become better at explaining to yourself why your dreams aren't realistic anymore. Maybe your dream was to open a little kebab shop like the one I am in at the moment. You imagined having your own place, making the food exactly the way you wanted, knowing your regular customers, and eventually being able to look around and say, I built this. Then you started thinking about what it would actually take: the money, the rent, the equipment, the employees, and the possibility that customers wouldn't even show up. And suddenly, that dream doesn't feel quite as romantic anymore. You tell yourself you'll do it someday, then someday becomes next year becomes 5 years, and eventually you don't even think about opening the kebab shop anymore. Not because you stopped loving the idea, you just convinced yourself it wasn't going to happen. And honestly, I think that's where a lot of us are at the moment. We've become very good at being realistic. And yeah, sometimes that's a really good thing. Reality matters. You can't pay your electricity bill with passion. But there comes a point where being realistic can quietly turn into giving up. And that's what I really want to talk about today. Why do so many of us give up on the things we once desperately wanted? And more importantly, is giving up always the same thing as growing up? I don't actually think giving up on a dream is always a bad thing. And I know that probably sounds like I'm contradicting everything I just said. Because you hear this stuff all the time, right? Never give up, follow your dreams, keep going no matter what. And sure, there's something nice about that, but I don't think it's always true. Sometimes you should actually give up on a dream. Sometimes the thing you thought you wanted when you were 18 isn't the thing you want when you're 28, and that's okay. That's all right. Maybe you wanted to become a professional footballer when you were a kid. You spent years playing, training, watching games, imagining yourself in a stadium. Then maybe you got older, you play at a higher level, you actually experience what it takes, and you realize you don't actually want that life anymore. Maybe you still love football, you just don't want to spend 6 hours a day training, traveling, constantly dealing with injuries, and living under that kind of pressure. Walking away from that isn't necessarily failure. Maybe you just learned something about yourself. And I think that's an important distinction. There is a difference between giving up because you no longer want something and giving up because you're scared you won't get it. Those two things can look exactly the same from the outside, but they are completely different. If you genuinely don't want the dream anymore, there's nothing wrong with letting it go. But if you still want it, if you still think about it when you're alone, If you still get that little feeling in your stomach when you imagine what your life could look like, then maybe you actually haven't moved on. Maybe you're scared. And I think a lot of people confuse those two things. We become very good at explaining our fear to ourselves, saying something like, I've grown up, I'm being realistic, I have responsibilities now, it's probably not practical. And sometimes those things are absolutely true. Reality matters, money matters, and you do need to earn for your family. If you got a family depending on you, you can't just throw everything away because you suddenly decide you're going to become a rock star. That's obviously not how life works. But sometimes being realistic is just a nicer way of saying I'm afraid to find out whether I can actually do this, and that's a difficult thing to admit because failure is embarrassing, especially when you've told people about your dream. Imagine telling everyone you're going to open that kebab shop. You talk about it for years, you tell your friends, your family, everyone knows, and then you finally do it, and 6 months later the shop closes. That's going to hurt, and not just financially. You're going to feel like an idiot. You're going to think about what everyone uh, you're going to think about everyone who told you it wouldn't work, and you're going to wonder whether they were right. And that's one of the reasons people don't even try, because if you never try, you never have to experience that kind of failure. But there's another side to that. If you never try, you'll never know either. And honestly, I think that's sometimes worse, because failure at least gives you an answer. You tried something, you learned, maybe you discovered you weren't good at it, maybe you discovered you needed more money, maybe you discovered you needed more experience, maybe you discovered you didn't even enjoy doing it. So all of those things are useful. What really sucks is spending 10 years wondering, what if I had just tried? And I think that's probably one of the most painful questions a person can carry, because you can't go back in time and test the other version of your life. We only get to live one reality of our life, if that makes sense. You don't know what would have happened. And there's something else I've learned about dreams. Sometimes progress is so slow that it doesn't even feel like progress. You start something and you're excited, you think, all right, I'm going to do this. And then a month passes, nothing. Another month, still nothing. 6 months later, you're sitting there wondering whether you're wasting your time. And that's where most people probably quit. And not just because the dream is impossible, it just became boring. And I think that's something nobody really tells you about pursuing anything. The exciting part is actually very short. Starting is exciting, the first few wins are exciting, but then there's this massive stretch in the middle where you're basically doing the same thing over and over again without knowing whether it's going to work. And that's the part that sucks. That's the part where you have to keep going without getting much in return. And honestly, that's where I am with this channel. I'm not sitting here pretending I've got everything figured out, obviously. And I got like 180 subscribers, and I do have some watch time, but obviously it's nowhere near where I want it to be, and that's probably fine. I'm not expecting some giant breakthrough every week, just small progress, just to show me something that I'm moving forward. If you have like 20 people watching you today, 50 people might watch you from 6 months from now on. So and that's progress. If you're making something better today than you were a year ago, that's progress. If you're learning something every time you fail, that's progress. It just doesn't feel very impressive while you're living through it. And I think social media actually makes this so much worse, because you see the person who started 6 months ago and now has a million followers. You don't see the 10,000 people who started 6 months ago and got nowhere. You see the guy who made it, and you just don't see everyone who disappeared. So you start thinking you're behind, and maybe you're not. Maybe you're just watching someone else's highlight, while you're living through your own boring middle chapter. And there's nothing wrong with having a boring middle chapter in life. In fact, that's probably where most of life happens. Another thing I think we need to talk about is circumstances, because sometimes life genuinely gets in the way. People have kids, families, they lose jobs, their family members get sick, they have to take care of their parents, financial situations change. Sometimes the dream that was possible at 20 genuinely isn't possible in exactly the same way at 35. And I don't think we should beat ourselves up over that. You don't owe your 15-year-old self the exact life he or she imagined. That's something I wish more people understood. The person you were 10 years ago didn't know what your life was going to look like. He didn't know what you would experience. He didn't know what you would learn. He didn't know what responsibility you would have. So you're allowed to change your plans. You're actually allowed to say, actually, I don't want this anymore. You're allowed to say, this isn't possible for me right now. And you're even allowed to say, maybe I'll come back to this later when I do have the right circumstances and time to follow my dreams or pursue whatever you want to pursue. That's not failure, and that's life. The problem comes when you don't actually want to give up. You just think you have to, and there's a difference. Maybe you don't need to choose between your dream and your current life. Maybe you can build the dream alongside the life you already have. That's probably the most realistic way to do it for most people. You don't necessarily need to quit your job tomorrow. You don't need to sell your house. You don't need to gamble everything. Maybe you just work your job, you pay your bills, you save some money, and then after work you spend an hour doing something that belongs to you. Maybe you make videos, maybe you write, maybe you learn to code, maybe you practice music, maybe you work on the business idea you've had for 5 years, maybe you make a kebab. I don't know. But eventually those little hours add up, and there's something I think people underestimate. uh, an hour doesn't feel like much. One video doesn't feel like much. One customer doesn't feel like much. One page doesn't feel like much. But if you keep doing it for 5 years, that's a completely different story. And maybe that's what chasing a dream actually looks like for most of us. Not jumping off a cliff, just slowly building another path while you're walking down the one you're currently on. And eventually maybe that second path gets big enough that you can actually move over to it. Maybe it doesn't, and that's where I think we need to be honest. There is no guarantee. I can't sit here and tell you that if you work hard enough, your dream will definitely come true. That's bullshit. Sometimes people work incredibly hard and still don't get what they want. Sometimes people are talented and still fail. Sometimes the timing sucks. Sometimes luck matters. Sometimes the opportunity just never comes. But that doesn't mean trying was pointless. Maybe there's something else you get from trying. You get to find out who you are. You find out what you're capable of. You find out what you actually care about. You find out what you're willing to sacrifice for. And sometimes you even find a completely different dream along the way. So if there's something you've been thinking about giving up on, I guess I'd ask yourself one question. uh, do you actually not want it anymore, or are you just afraid that you will not succeed? Because if you genuinely don't want it anymore, that's okay, let it go. You don't have to spend your entire life chasing something just because your younger self wanted it. But if you still want it, if you still think about it, if you're still watching videos about it at 2 in the morning, if you still imagine yourself doing it, maybe don't kill the dream just yet. Maybe make it a smaller, maybe scale it down, maybe change the plan. Maybe give yourself another 5 years instead of expecting it to happen in 5 months, because 5 years are going to pass anyway. You'll be older, I'll be older, we'll all be somewhere else. And the question is really just where we want to be when we get there. Maybe I'll still be making videos, maybe I'll still be working a normal job. Maybe this channel will become something much bigger. I genuinely don't know, and that's actually okay, because I don't need to know exactly how the story ends to keep writing it. And maybe that's what I would say to anyone watching this. You don't need to have your entire life figured out. You don't need to know whether your dream will work. You don't need some guarantee that everything will be okay. Sometimes you just need to take the next step. And if you eventually realize that the dream isn't yours anymore, that's all right too. Change direction, try something else, make a different plan. Just don't give up on something you still love purely because you're afraid of failing. Maybe because your dream doesn't need you to be fearless. Maybe it just needs you to keep going anyway. I've spent about the last 15 minutes talking about dreams while running a virtual kebab shop, so I suppose I should probably uh, focus on making kebabs. And if your dream really is to open a kebab shop, I really hope you fucking do it. Just maybe don't ask me to run the place. I'll clearly spend the entire shift talking about my dreams instead of cooking.